we are at the beginning of a new paradigm where these types of regulations are going to be backed by very significant enforcement actions. And so organizations need to be thinking about, hey, what's the next domino to fall from a supply chain transparency perspective?
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
We are recording this. It's definitely fall. In the Memphis area, Lalo, I will tell you, it's been great. Weather-wise is getting a little bit better, but it got a little bit warm. We got back up into the 90s, although the humidity for us has dropped down really low. So that's actually made it a much more bearable. So I'm sitting there loving that kind of stuff. How's your fall going down there in Texas?
Well, pretty good. Actually, I should say weather-wise, it's okay, but this is a time of year where there's a couple of things going on that get really exciting. I mean, it's like almost every day there's sports, some kind of sports. So I was just talking to our guest about even though I'm in Texas, I'm a big Yankee fan, and people probably already know that on the team on the podcast. But yeah, exactly, yeah. So Yankees, unfortunately, are not going to the playoffs this year. First year as Aaron Judge as a captain, and they're not going to playoffs. So it's a little sad, first of all. Second of all, Dallas Cowboys, now I am a big fan. I mean, I am a big Dallas Cowboys fan. So anyway,
Cowboys had a little bit of a problem this past week, didn't they?
They did, man. That was horrible. So as we're recording this, I mean, I know it's going to be different timing and everything. So it's the last week in September. So just to put things in perspective, and by the time this airs, the playoffs for baseball are already going on because, they should be going on. But anyways, our next guest is from Canada. And so he's pretty excited that his team has a very, very good chance. I mean, they're right there on the cusp of making the playoffs. So, but anyway, but yeah, so just to answer your question, I love this time of year because of that. It's fall, it's getting cooler. I'm not a big pumpkin spice, coffee drinker or anything, but I mean, I know that's a big deal too. So, but anyway, but yeah, so that's where I am right now.
Well, I'll tell you what, I love pumpkin pie. The coffee, the pumpkin spice kind of stuff. Yeah, it's okay, I guess, for coffee, but it's, I'm more of like, give me the pumpkin pie and the pumpkin bread and all that kind of stuff. But I will say that, folks, we are real fortunate in that we're going to get to talk about some really cool things from somebody that's up north of us here. It's in the Toronto area, and we're going to get to talk about how do you handle, everybody knows and has heard about the laws and regulations that have come through, like with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and Canada and Mexico both have had, forced labor prevention. It's anti-slavery type activities. There have been other things have gone in where there have been issues where, at least in the U.S., components from China that have been had extra tariffs put on them. Well, China has been shipping their components to other countries into factories there, and so the components have been manufactured into other products. Man, I'll tell you, I don't know what the deal is with my throat here today. Anyway, so how do you keep up with all that? So we're going to have a good discussion to figure this out, to how to pull people together. I'm looking forward to this. But we have a fellow by the name of Jackson Wood from Descartes, who is a very excellent. Descartes is a very good Canadian company, has done quite a few acquisitions, has grown very large, but they have some really fantastic folks. But as we were talking, the Toronto Blue Jays what we were talking about there. And then to their credit, I will say, Jackson, I had the privilege of working in Canada for 5 years, made some great friends. I was in the Toronto area. I was actually living in Mississauga. And, but when I was up there is when the Blue Jays were back-to-back world champions. And it was a great, great, great time. And, I know that, folks, they love those Blue Jays up there. So to your credit, that's excellent. But welcome to our show. Why don't you tell folks a little bit about yourself and your background and what you do for Descartes?
Sure. Thanks so much, Andy, Lalo, for the opportunity to be here. And I also appreciate the love for the Blue Jays. I mean, this is a team that isn't just representing a city or a province, it's representing a whole country. And so I think that there's a lot of the energy and the enthusiasm that you see for Blue Jays fans is just partly because they're the only team in town. It is a little bit of a sad fact that we lost the Expos a number of years. And, we continue to get teased a little bit with, oh, well, maybe we'll put a team back in Montreal. I think it would be awesome for Canadian baseball fans, but the Blue Jays will have to do for now. And hopefully we're about to embark on a long playoff run, touch wood. So, yeah, as you said, my name's Jackson Wood. I'm the Director of Industry Strategy for our Global Trade Intelligence solutions here at Descartes Systems Group. As you touched on, we are a multinational logistics supply chain and trade compliance enabling organization. We were founded in Waterloo in the early 80s. And Waterloo, for those who don't know, is sort of like Canada's Silicon Valley. Probably the most famous company that's come out of there, other than us, of course, is BlackBerry. And so we really have a long history of innovation and investment with our customers in solving emerging challenges. And I think we're at a very interesting time, at least when we talk to our customers on the trade compliance side, around the intermingling and the beginnings of motion towards a little bit more of a holistic approach for global organizations to think about not just trade compliance, but broader risks around corporate image and reputation, business resiliency. And we really see this as a pivotal moment in terms of, hey, how do we continue to build our capabilities and our expertise to enable our customers to navigate what I think are going to be some fairly turbulent, but hopefully waters full of opportunity as we head into the next few months and years. So really my role to put a fine point on it is I work collaboratively across our entire team here in the GTI, Global Trade Intelligence part of our business. So I work with our research and development engineers. I work with our product support people. I work very closely with our customers and prospective customers to help them really get a good sense of what problems they're trying to solve and ultimately how we'll be able to collaborate with them over the long term to solve those problems. So again, so excited to be here and thanks for the opportunity to chat with you guys.
You bet. Well, one of the things I will say that to your point, and this is one of the things, folks, this is going to be one of those, whether you're a service provider, you're an actual importer or exporter, if you're dealing with international trade, this is going to be a show that hopefully is going to stimulate you to think, stimulate your brain to really consider some things. You may be only dealing with some things domestically, but in that scenario there, you're going to have people that are providing you supplies or providing you services that deal in international. So you need to have, some thoughts to say, where are they getting their goods from? So in that realm. So as we're talking through, let's look at this from a strategic standpoint. That in today's world, we just mentioned there's the anti-slavery legislation and regulations that are coming out of it. Obviously, the legislation goes through, and from that, the different bureaucratic departments of a government will then draft up regulations on how to enforce the legislation. With that, again, some of it's good, some of it's bad, some of it's like, we're in new territory on how the governments are putting things forward. as I'm looking at some things to what Jackson folks are dealing with, there seems to be an issue right now where when you source goods and you're buying these goods, you're dealing with, let's say, a distributor from somewhere, maybe in a foreign country, maybe in the U.S., but then they're getting it from a foreign source. And as in today's world, if I'm an importer, I have the obligation to say, where are you getting your goods from? And your distributors are going to look at you and go, I'm not telling you that. You'll circumvent me and all of that. Unfortunately, the scenario as this works then is it makes it difficult on an importer to really show what would be considered due diligence. So as we're going through the needing transparent vendors, and in those kinds of things, what do you suggest when somebody's going in and looking at this kind of stuff, whether it's, you're buying goods or you're trying to sell goods out there and different things? What do you, what's our initial thought here? I mean, the compliance folks are probably going crazy over it and then trying to get other people to come to the table and collaborate in other departments. What do you suggest in this right now as far as the initial approach?
So I think there's a few things to consider here, Andy, and some of them are certainly on the practical side, but perhaps some of the concepts may be a bit more strategic or long-term in nature, because I think just to level set that in as much as some of these new regulatory instruments are new and somewhat innovative, as you said, in terms of how they're going to be enforced, I think the UFLPA enforcement is a great example of that, where, as you know, anything that is coming from certain regions of China, CBP is holding it under the presumption that there is forced labor or slave labor involved in the production of those goods. And the importer is under an obligation to prove to CBP that, in fact, those goods are clear of forced labor. So that's a really new paradigm for a CBP enforcement initiative. And I think what a lot of organizations are struggling with is trying to say, okay, well, this is probably a one-off, and we'll run some mock detention exercises and we'll start to get our ducks in a row in terms of how we're going to deal with this. But once we've got a bit of a box around how we're going to deal with potential UFLPA issues, then we can move on to other things. And, my own view and the view of some of the customers of ours that I've been speaking with is this is the beginning of a trend. And that more and more, the enforcement of these types of new regulatory programs is going to become more severe, because regulators and policymakers are beginning to realize that the only way to compel organizations to do a greater degree of due diligence, to be more transparent in both their import and export supply chains, is to put some real teeth behind these regulations. And I think if you look at ESG just as an example, that's a concept that goes back even beyond the introduction of ESG to corporate social responsibility. There's been a lot of talk, but not necessarily a lot of enforcement action behind some of those concepts. And so organizations have been going through the motions, so to speak, to say, yeah, yes, corporate social responsibility is important to us, but there wasn't necessarily any financial or reputational consequences to non-compliance there. And I think we are at the beginning of a new paradigm where these types of regulations are going to be backed by very significant enforcement actions. And so organizations need to be thinking about, hey, what's the next domino to fall from a supply chain transparency perspective? And how are we going to start building the right capabilities, the right internal governance structures that are going to help us do this very well? And to maybe more directly answer your question, Andy, like, what do organizations do today? The first thing is strike the appropriate level of internal governance collaboration around how are we going to get ourselves organized, not just from a capacity and a capability perspective, like who's doing what, but even more importantly, who's got the data that we need to be able to answer some of these questions from a regulatory perspective. And if we don't have that data, who's responsible for getting it? And that's where we come back to your comment about organizations perhaps either not being comfortable asking for or not getting the answers they need around, hey, where is the tier 2, tier 3, even beyond some of those higher level supplier relationships? Like, where is this material coming from? And it is very challenging to get some of those questions answered today.
Well, to that point, here's the thing that as we look at it, I will say that regarding, let's say that somebody is a company is selling, their products, their parts, whatever, online and whatnot. And there is a widget that they are deciding that they want to offer. So I want to give a story here. I want to give a scenario so that people can relate to this. Is like, well, this is what we're talking about as far as this collaboration goes. So when a part is added to a company's, I'll say, inventory arsenal of goods to sell, it may be just parts, it may be a finished good, whatever the case is. Whenever that is added to a company's catalog to start selling, it didn't just happen. That takes several weeks. Even if you're a small company, it takes a little while to get that. So it's like, okay, yeah, we need to start offering this product. Great. Is there a market for it? Sales, can you sell it? Wonderful there. All right. Purchasing or sourcing. Go out there and find a source for this. We think we have a good source here or there, whatever. So they start working on that for a while. And then there's the scenario here is like, okay, the purchasing groups are looking for bigger, better, faster, cheaper. Let me get a low cost of goods. Great. Well, you have that objective, but the compliance folks usually are way down in that role that usually sometimes they're not even included in the assessment of bringing in some goods. You've got your logistics and transportation folks. It's like, okay, somebody's found a factory in XYZ country. Now we need to be able to move it. We're going to move it to, is it by air, by rail, truck, or ocean, whatever. And you start working those things out. And then you've got the logistics on it. Well, when it starts transportation, it's moving, then we're going to have to store it and or put it in warehouses for pick and pack and all that comes into play. But then there's also the scenario here from the compliance arena going, oh, well, guess what? This is not a duty-free item. It's something that's, you're going to have duty. You may have, if it's sourced out of China or somewhere else, there may be added tariffs on it. There's an anti-dumping scenario in here or countervailing duty type scenario. Okay, well, that adds more cost. And people aren't thinking through this. So to me, this is one of those areas where you've got a team. So if you're an executive, look at it this way. If you're, coaching a basketball team, you've got 5 players on the court. Each player has a significant role to play. Each department, therefore, and then the analogy has a significant role to play, but they all need to work together to have success in this scenario. And there may be a scenario going, you know what? This is not necessarily the right play to make on this particular widget out of XYZ country. We may need to look at a different source. So to pull that off and pulling those people together, especially the purchasing, the logistics, the transportation, the compliance, even your IT systems and things of that nature, what do you think there, Jackson, as far as how to try and pull those folks together?
Well, I think it's a good question. It's going to vary by organization, of course, right? So we serve customers in all different industries, all different sizes. And I've spent the better part of the last year really having in-depth conversations with our customer base about these types of issues. And what I can tell you is, the common thread is that everybody recognizes it as an internal governance and collaboration challenge. And how are we going to get all of those different areas of expertise and all of those different areas of internal, whether it's data, systems, as you said, Andy, how are we all going to get on the same page, speaking the same language about protecting our organization from regulatory risk, from reputational risk, and from resiliency risk? So that's the common thread. But what's very different, depending on the maturity of the organization or what industry it's in, is who's chairing those internal governance discussions. Is it the chief legal officer? Is it the chief compliance officer? Is it the CFO? Is it and this was a real learning moment for me. One of our large retail customers now has a chief ethics officer in place, and this is a new role to the organization. And their primary mandate right now is chairing these internal governance tables to say, okay, what's the role of strategic sourcing here? What's the role of our legal operations team? What's the role of our warehousing and inventory management group? What's the role of trade compliance? And by all accounts, these conversations are pretty clunky in the early going because organizations have never talked about this stuff in a connected way before. And so where we're getting asked for a lot of help is, hey, do you have a technology solution that can tie this all together? And as much as we would love to sell more technology solutions, what we're trying to say is, look, this is not a technology problem right now. This is an internal collaboration challenge. And we think there's a lot of opportunity on the other side of the bumpiness in terms of better internal visibility, better external invisibility. And, just speaking anecdotally, part of the reason why the chief ethics officer is convening some of these meetings is the chief ethics officer is accountable for some of the disclosures that have to happen, not only to the board of directors, but also to external stakeholders. And so the chief ethics officer has a deliverable of saying, here's the internal and external mapping of how goods, services, and capital flow throughout our international supply chain. So there's a lot of motivation on his or her end to be able to generate those reports, but they go around asking these discrete functions for that data, and either they don't, trade compliance doesn't understand the question or doesn't have it because, sourcing maintains that data set or the supply chain folks maintain that data set.
As you're looking at, you're hitting on something. Forgive me for dealing with this, but I think there's an important point here is that regardless of whatever the title the person has, there has to be somebody that takes ownership of this type of collaboration so that within a company, and it needs to be high enough. I mean, I've personally done quite a few of these with companies. Now, it's interesting to get with this, but a collaborative meeting where you need to have an executive. It could be the chief operating officer. It could be the CFO. It could be the ethics or compliance type thing. Someone needs to be high enough in the C-suite, or in this case, it could be an owner or partner of a company. The point being is hosting a meeting that initially kicks this thing off, and you bring together representatives, preferably like middle management initially, from the different areas that we're just talking about. And then you start going through and talking about it. And, you kick this off. But the issue that I find, Jackson, is that you're hitting the nail on the head where people start talking about how do we need to do this. And then you host these meetings to say, here's what we're striving to accomplish. And in that, the role that everybody plays comes in there. And one of the things I will say is a lot of times people are looking for an automated systemic solution. Well, if you're not doing it manually through the process, and part of the manual process is literally sharing information with the different departments in that internal governance, you're not going to be able to come in with an automated solution because it's not going to have input in the configuration from all the different areas. So let's back up. Having the conversation, let's talk through these things. Hey, we're thinking about sourcing from this country, or we're thinking about selling and going into this country. Okay, the compliance people need to be look at it and say, well, you know what? Let me look at the widgets that you're wanting to do and see what the requirements are for shipping into or out of those countries. What are the transportation? Do we have some routes in those that with different carriers? I mean, everybody has an opportunity to offer some of that kind of stuff. But the key is having somebody, whether it's an ethics or compliance or something, somebody high enough that can transcend and cross over the different silos of a company to pull that together. Would you think that that would be a formula for a successful meeting and objective in what we're striving here?
Yeah, I think that's well put, Andy. And I might go one step further and say it's really important to think about this beyond the initial meeting, right? Like it's not just the COO or the CFO or the CEO saying, okay, we're going to do a big bang. I'm pulling in the operational heads for all these different departments, and I'm putting a stake in the ground and saying that this is going to happen. And then we're all going to stack hands at the end of the meeting and it's going to happen, right? We all know that that's not really a formula for success. So there needs to be a sustainable commitment made at the governance level with the appropriate level of executive sponsorship to say, we're going to keep talking about and focusing on and collaborating across these different dimensions, whether it's we've got to protect ourselves from regulatory risk, fines, penalties, withheld shipments. We've got to protect ourselves from maybe doing business with someone who there's no legal reason why we can't, but we don't really want our brand associated either with this organization or with this country for any number of reasons, whether that's on the forced labor side, whether that's environmental degradation, whether that's political corruption, et cetera. Like we have to think about protecting our organization's reputation. And then finally, we've got to make sure that this is going to be a resilient relationship, right? So if this is a key supplier that we've done the regulatory due diligence on, looks good from a financial perspective, things are strong. We don't have to worry about things from a reputational perspective, but we talk about whether it's climate change, we talk about geopolitical volatility. Is this supplier located in a jurisdiction that's at risk from floods that didn't happen 10 or 15 years ago? Are they trending in the wrong direction from a political or a social perspective? And so we get 2-3 years into this relationship and all of a sudden they're no longer able to meet their obligations to us. Like that's now something that has to be pulled forward into the strategic assessments of how we want to do business in this new world. And so I think that's why the important point is it's not just one meeting, it's an ongoing commitment to driving collaboration across these functions with a view of protecting the organizations from these very different types of risks than we've faced in the past.
So with that, let me ask this question. From your perspective, what would be maybe, 2 or 3 of the key questions that you would say an executive needs to be asking their folks internally?
Sure. And I'll provide a couple of anecdotal examples of that because I think this has been a really big learning for me and our organization over the past 6 months or so, is that especially if you're in a very big organization that has, forget about operations around the world, but that has tens of thousands of employees, all very busy doing a lot of different things, is how do we make this a manageable challenge? Right. And so it starts with a risk-based approach, and compliance folks are going to be very familiar with risk stratification and recognizing that 80% of or 20% of our business probably represents 80% of our risk. The first thing is once we've identified the appropriate stakeholders, and again, that's going to be unique based on our organization, but we've got strategic sourcing or procurement. We've got trade compliance. We've got legal. We've got logistics, warehousing, et cetera. The first thing to land on is where do we have our biggest exposure to risk, right? Is it in a particular type of product or service that we are purchasing or delivering? Or is it purely geographic based, right? Like we are over invested in China as an example, right? Like 90% of our most strategic products are coming out of China. We have to do that risk stratification so that we're able to manage in an appropriate way some kind of progress. Because if you look at, there are certain global organizations that have tens of millions of SKUs. They have tens of thousands of suppliers. Like, where do you even start? It starts with a risk stratification exercise of recognizing where we have our most exposure And we are going to do a series of sprints. We are going to say this quarter is going to be focused on these top 5 highest risk commodities. And we are going to do everything we can to start building some boundaries around how we do that business to put us in a position to then move on to the next 5 most risky. And I'm speaking a bit generally here, Andy, because again, every organization is going to be different.
Something that your approach, I love where you're going, Jackson, because it's like, okay, you've got, this huge catalog of parts or parts listing is like, where do you start? Well, breaking it down, keeping it simple, but getting it down to the same, where is your highest risk areas? Well, that's, and if you're in the compliance arena, that's something that, folks, you need to be looking at it. What would be your back pocket list, is what I used to call it, of things that you need to, if you had the opportunity to talk to the C-suite, what would be the main points that you need to say, hey, if you get a chance, you ought to look at X, Y, and Z situation, because we're a bit vulnerable right there. If somebody were to ask you that, if you had a 30-second elevator ride with somebody, it's like, hey, listen, appreciate what you're doing. Just know that at some point, you ought to, we need to take a look at sourcing this widget out of China and see, consider changing locations on it or whatever. I mean, something like that. You've got to be prepared so that when you're asked, you have something to respond, not like, oh, you know what, that's a good question. Let me come back and get back to you on that.
Yep. And, we were talking about this just as we were preparing to record the episode, but we've all been around trade compliance for a really long time. I started my career in the space in the early 2000s. And the one common complaint, for lack of a better word, that I've heard across that time is trade compliance is not seen as a strategic function of the organization. It's seen as a headwind to the business. It's seen as a friction point. It doesn't help us grow. Sure, you could argue that it keeps us out of trouble, but that doesn't help us, improve either top or bottom line growth. And so trade compliance professionals have struggled for a really long time of trying to recast the function in a more strategic light. And I think now, and this was catalyzed, at least in our experience with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, of suddenly people running trade compliance functions were getting calls from the CEO who was about to brief the board of directors on our exposure to risk as a result of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And really the only function that could give him or her any insight into that was the trade compliance team. And so these hardworking professionals who for decades have toiled away in the shadows of an organization are suddenly thrust into the spotlight of helping protect their global organization from getting intertwined into a really terrible risk situation. And I think now is the opportunity for trade compliance to continue to add that strategic value. And just an anecdotal piece on that, I was talking to one of our customers last week who is, she leads the trade compliance function for a large global electronics firm. And she's at the table in this sort of context of governance. The group is being chaired by the chief legal officer, and trade compliance is there, strategic sourcing, et cetera. And what is slowly starting to dawn on the chief legal officer is that the greatest leverage point inside the organization from a knowledge and from an expertise perspective is the trade compliance team. And so all of a sudden, she's gone from being a seat at the table to a really core driver of progress and ultimately impact on this team, because she and her trade compliance teams have the experience, the familiarity with navigating international regulations, and the intimacy to physical goods, whether that's tariff classification, whether that's understanding rules of origin in the context of free trade agreements, in a way that a lot of her colleagues in other parts of the organization simply don't have. So this, to me, is in some ways the coming out party for trade compliance as a core strategic value creator inside of organizations. And this is what we've all been looking for at least the last 20 years.
Well, and it allows the compliance group to become proactive rather than reactive constantly, where the compliance has not been involved as much in traditionally in days gone by on some things. And so then when people have made some strategic decisions, we're going to go this way, that we're going to source here, whatever. And the next thing you know, you've got the proverbial, and a lot of people laugh when I say it, but it's like the compliance team winds up being the pooper scooper at the end of a parade trying to clean up a mess. And so it's like, okay, now utilizing when people recognize, and I say people, I'm talking about the legal side, the C-suite, the executives, the whatever, on the resource that compliance folks are in the knowledge and the things of that nature, and they include them in their strategic plan or planning sessions. It's one of those things where, it's the 110-100 rule. If I fix a problem up front, cost me $1. If I wait a little bit, it may cost me $10. But if I wait on down the road, it's going to cost me 100 times whatever it was. So the point being is being involved on the front end makes things move so much smoother. But you have to have a scenario where the compliance can't just be in a silo themselves. They have got to reach out to the purchasing and the transportation and the logistics and the IT and all that, as well as those departments reach out to the compliance and include them in that kind of stuff.
Yep. And that's where it's so important that these governance models are not one and done, right? Because you're trying to undo decades of norms and behaviors with inside organizations of, look, I work in this silo. This is where my accountability resides. And so this is where I'm going to stay focused. And maybe if I'm in strategic sourcing, maybe I remember to reach out to the trade compliance folks for some input on landed cost calculations or understanding whether we've got some regulatory exposure. That cannot, if we don't maintain hyper focus on trying to adjust our ways of working, we're just going to stay status quo. And that's why executive sponsorship and executive involvement in trying to manage this evolved way of working going forward is going to be essential to sustainable success. And the last thing I'd say on that is where we have seen customers, at least within our customer community, make the most meaningful progress is where the chief executive officer or the board of directors has publicly put a stake in the ground and said, our organization is committed to rooting forced labor out of our supply chain. Our organization is committed to building resiliency into our supply chain. Our organization is committed to doing everything we can to be a good, upstanding corporate citizen. And when very senior leadership and very important stakeholders put their weight behind that commitment, all of a sudden some of that internal friction starts to be relieved, and you start to really get meaningful progress towards that type of cross-functional collaboration we know is going to be essential for success in this area.
Well, I will say we're going to need to wrap up this particular show on some things, but I will say, hopefully, folks, you are hearing what Jackson is emphasizing here. And as we're looking at it, again, some companies have a logistics council, some have different things. You call it different things, but it's one of those where if you are not participating in a collaborative meeting of different areas of the company to talk over strategically, where you are selling or sourcing goods, you need to give that some thought, and it needs to come from your executive level so that strategically, what are you striving to accomplish in today's world? You want to penetrate markets that you're currently in. You want to penetrate them even deeper, or you want to penetrate new markets. Well, to sell your goods, you've got to look at it and use your team. Everybody has a part to play in all of that. So I guess coming back around to this scenario here is at the executive level, what would be the one main takeaway here, Jackson, that you could suggest that somebody that's listening to us and say, okay, you know what, you've piqued my interest, I need to do something on this. What would be the key takeaway for their next step?
So I think it starts with identifying, even if you're not going to get it perfect right off the bat, but identifying who you think the constituents within the organization are, who are going to have a perspective and some capabilities that are going to help here, right? So I think that's the first thing. The second thing, and this may sound a little bit different because it's a little bit sort of high level, but I think one of the things that creates a lot of challenge in these types of multi-stakeholder internal governance undertakings is, what's our common language, right? Procurement speaks one language, trade compliance speaks one language, supply chain speaks one language, et cetera. So a big impact that an executive sponsor can have is saying, this is going to be our common language, our common framework for how we're going to work together going forward. And what we've been suggesting to our customers is this 3-dimensional risk approach. We need to think about our regulatory risks, right? So this is everything that we can and can't do from a legal regulatory perspective. We then have to think about our reputational risks. So yes, maybe legally we can do this, but should we do it? Is it aligned to our values as an organization? Is it aligned to the commitments that we've made to our staff, to our stakeholders, et cetera? And then the third dimension of risk is resiliency risk. Will this relationship stand the test of time? Can we rely on this third-party partner to be a strategic enabler of value for our organization over the long term? And the executive has the power to say, this is how we're going to look at this across all these different functions. And so I think utilizing that type of strategic framework in an initial meeting can set that group up for success over the long term, because we've established a common language and a common set of lenses that we're going to evaluate these problems in. And that helps to break down some of these jargon or these sort of discipline silos that exist, because everybody lives in a different world on a day-to-day basis.
That is all right. So you've got regulatory risk, you've got reputation risk, and resiliency risk. And those 3 things are paramount. Excellent conversations there, Jackson. I appreciate that. Folks, I hope that you're looking at this. We're going to have Jackson's contact information out there, as well as if you have some other questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Lalo on this. The other side of this is, as you're looking at it, don't think you need to do this all on your own. That's why I was saying with the contacts, get people that are, experts in doing this. It's a relatively short project that could get this thing launched, and keeping it going is another scenario there. But at least getting it pulled together, you may find that there's also the opportunity to eliminate exceptions and issues in your supply chain that you didn't realize was there until you got all these key folks in the room. As you go through, and you can streamline your process, reduce your cycle times, reduce your costs, and improve your service. So all of that to say, Jackson, I want to say this has been an excellent conversation, and greatly appreciate you being on our show.
It's been my pleasure, guys. I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Lalo, anything last comments for us?
No. Just sitting back and enjoying the conversation. Sorry I didn't participate too much, but it was really interesting. Thank you very much for coming on, Jackson. Thank you. And I know we have a few other topics we're going to talk to you about, but this was a good start.
Well, it's a good start, and it's also going to be one that, folks, there are going to be practical solutions as we get into this series on what to do, how to deal with it. Again, remember, there are new laws and regulations that are requiring greater transparency of your sources, and some of that's a challenge. And so we'll be getting into, well, even as we're talking about the risks that we've talked about and all that, how do you vet a new supplier or even some of your customers, and what are they doing with your goods when you sell them? You've got to keep up with that kind of stuff. Well, how do you do that is what we're going to get into. So with that, Jackson, again, thank you, sir. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and Lalo, and to the rest of our listeners, you have a great day.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center.
You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.